Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar about Polarian requirements. My name is David Merrill. I'm a system engineer with Polarian, and for the next hour or so, it will be my privilege to give you a tour through some of the concepts about requirements management and how Polarian addresses those as a solution. I would encourage you to participate actively via the Q&A, the questions and answers module of WebEx throughout the presentation. I'm joined by some colleagues as panelists who will be able to respond to your questions in line, as well as from time to time throughout my presentation, I'll pause and take a look at some of those questions and address them verbally. And hopefully, if you contribute and become interactive, I'll be able to actually respond in the product to some of the questions you ask. Before we get started, if you have any difficulty with the audio or video portion of the webinar, please visit www.polarian.com, where you can replay this webinar and other Polarian product demonstrations. You can do your own self-paced test drive or download a 30-day trial of Polarian requirements at any time on your system. It's a fully functioning user or unlimited number of users for 30 days. Well, the agenda today is actually quite simple. I'm going to begin talking about the requirements questions, and then hopefully be able to show you how to get it done in Polarian. We'll end with an open question and answer session where I'll pause and take your questions directly. And then we'll talk a little bit more about some of the next steps that you might take. Well, let me begin with some requirements questions. What, why, who, when, where, and how. Now, this might seem a very unconventional way of approaching the idea of requirements, but hopefully in the next few minutes I'll be able to explain them, what they mean to requirements management, and then how to both answer and solve some of these questions using the Polarian solution. So the first question is, what is Polarian? Polarian offers three central solutions: Polarian ALM, which is a superset of all application lifecycle management functions and features; Polarian QA, quality assurance, which focuses on test management; and really what we'll be talking about today, which is Polarian requirements, a focused set of license and capability to develop, elicit, and communicate requirements throughout your entire enterprise organization. The solution we'll be talking about today is not limited to just software, and it's not just limited to hardware, but rather it incorporates a variety of different industries, not only industries, but also the methodologies that might be applied in an industry. So, for example, a medical industry that produces a medical device must be compliant with international and FDA regulations. A Polarian customer in aerospace has to be audited by the FAA and prove that they comply both with industry standards and their own internal product development controls and process. So in order to do that, Polarian adapts to all of these different processes. So I can just use it for requirements management, or I can extend the usability of Polarian to touch both test management and change management aspects, and continue on and handle some of the aspects associated with the development process itself, development and other work tasks that are performed and need to be monitored. All of these aspects, whether they cover quality, whether they are ideally suited to collaborating both inside and outside your company, Polarian searches to solve all of these development issues with the Polarian solution. And hopefully, if I do my job well today, you'll have a good sense of how Polarian can respond to all of these diversified needs. First and foremost, the product that you see today is the result of being driven by the Polarian customers. So here's an example of some of the customers actively using Polarian. And they vary from software manufacturers to aerospace, medical systems, high technology, as well as more conventional manufacturing as well. Polarian, the product that we'll talk about today, is founded on a Web 2.0 architecture. So we'll be driving it entirely from a browser. And so it won't matter to me whether it's a local install inside my corporation or a hosted install in the internet cloud, where all stakeholders and suppliers of my organization can have access to the right amount of data. We also provide some more embedded clients. So for developers using some of common tools like Eclipse and Visual Studio as integrated development environments, we can bring Polarian information directly to those applications so that they can do all of their work from common interfaces. And so is true for Microsoft Office. You would be able to continue to use Word and Excel as a vehicle to communicate information and requirements to your stakeholders, whether those stakeholders are outside your company or perhaps an executive inside the company that is used to the process of reviewing and approving requirements documents that exist as Word. And as we get more detailed into some of the capabilities of the Polarian interface, the extensions and ecosystem of the Polarian community will let you build beyond what Polarian even offers as a tool and solution, because at this interface level here where I have web services, Java APIs, SOAP services, and interface to XML data, that information can be extended beyond Polarian so that the same APIs that our own developers use in creating the Polarian tool, you would be able to use to build specialized capability for Polarian in your environment. It's not necessary to get started. In fact, you will see that it's very easy to get started initially with Polarian. However, it becomes very extensible in the long term of its use and can be highly customized as required by our customers. And then all of these customizations can function at the same block level as our regular operations. These servlets that manage testing, that manage requirements, can be easily built by customers because it all sits on top of a very powerful Polarian server that is a web server and repository of information and database that is web searchable. So we'll be able to have Google-like search capability across all our information. All right, well, let's start at a fundamental level now. What is Polarian? We've sort of addressed. What is a requirement? Now, if we just simply look up the dictionary definition of a requirement, it's not very helpful for us in the area of product development. But it is certainly something that we need to have in producing the world's products and services. But how many types of requirements are there? Let's take one view, a simplified view of requirements management. I have simply a group of requirements, and those are created sometimes in documents or in other tools, and those requirements are implemented and developed. Once implementation is completed, or during the process of implementing, I create test cases which can verify the completion or the acceptance and implementation of those requirements. This is just one type of requirement, and it may be absolutely appropriate for some product development methodologies. But many Polarian customers need to have a more complex breakdown of requirements. So instead of just one type of requirement that applies to everything that we do, we start out with perhaps a higher level system requirement. And that system requirement gives us the basic functionality of the whole system. But it breaks down into, in some cases, the needs of the software application, a user interface, or a server application. And so I have software requirements. Additionally, if I'm dealing with a mechanical device, a mechatronics device, my project could also have mechanical requirements. Consider, if you will, something like an Apple iPad or an Android tablet, where the lines between the hardware device and the software that it uses is grayed somewhat, and manufacturers have to release both sets of products as one. Well, these system requirements map into software and mechanical requirements, and in many cases, Mechanical requirements can become even more detailed with design specifications. And so whether they're software or whether they're mechanical requirements, the developers might detail how that design should be established. Perhaps this design specification is for release to a contractor or a supplier who is being outsourced to provide a particular chip or a particular case or function within the total system. So now all four of these types of requirements might come together and have implementing tasks. And these implementing tasks are the work that the developers do to fulfill it. And the lines that are drawn between the area of gathering and eliciting and defining requirements and the change that happens when these tasks are implementing become very, very gray from product to product. Because as a process of implementing these tasks, I will also create validation or test steps that have to relate back to these requirements. So for design validation, linking to the specifications, mechanical tests to the mechanical requirements, software and system test cases. All of these test cases have to be linked back to requirements to build what we refer to as traceability. Traceability in the breakdown of system requirements through these lower level types of specifications and requirements, and the validation step where I verify that the requirement has been correctly written, correctly implemented, and can ultimately be passed to our customers. For some of you, this is probably old news, but sometimes we have people who are not used to seeing this kind of a breakdown. And the important note here is that Polarian is designed to handle both the simple and the complex breakdown of requirements. Well, there is a dilemma in requirements management. The first one is what Donald Rumsfeld called a while ago known knowns. We know about the information that we track today. These requirements would exist in documents. The workflows associated with the requirements documents are manually enforced. We have success today, but we see that we need some improvement and we need to gain the efficiency. Documents that exist on a file server are difficult to change for many users. Documents that exist in a SharePoint location have to be specifically traced throughout all the other design and requirements artifacts. Well, there's also known knowns. These are the things that we know that we don't know. So we know the things that we don't track today. We often find information about requirements that falls through the cracks in meetings and emails because it's difficult to get this information into a central system where everybody can view it. We know that the workflows don't always work the way they should, and there's too many exceptions. Problems and some of the artifacts might exist only in the heads of the engineers and stakeholders. So it really requires that they're in the right meeting at the right time for this information to come to light. Well, obviously, in Polarian, we want to be able to improve the known knowns, and we want to provide a system to capture the things we know we don't track today, because there's a third dilemma here, which is the unknown unknowns. In the unknown unknowns, we don't even know what we don't know. Because we can't solve these first two problems, we're not nimble enough to pick up new product design, to be able to respond quickly to the needs of auditors or the needs of suppliers in an expanding and complex development environment. Polarian requirements and the Polarian solution is to put in place the type of collaboration to respond to all three of these dilemmas. Let's extend this dilemma into answering the question or asking the question, why do projects fail? And Robert Charette, in a book he wrote, Why Software Fails, mentioned that the biggest tragedy is software failure is predictable and avoidable. It's not the complex things that cause projects to fail, but it's some of the most simple things, like poorly defined requirements, or risks that haven't been monitored, or project management information that didn't line up from a Microsoft project sheet with the actual information and work being done. It's not the complexity of the design of the tool that often cause failure, but the simple things in organizing the project and implementing the project across your entire organization. Well, where does this project failure start? Several industry groups have concluded that 60 to 80% of project failure begins with requirements, inadequate requirements. And even if we look at some specific failures, we see that because there isn't enough due diligence in the requirements elicitation phase, in the review and approval stage, we start developing a product that doesn't match what our customers need. And again, Polarian is designed to be a solution to that problem. So if we have an inability to track all the artifacts in process, sometimes even requirements management is not enough. And also in a book, two doctors, McManus and Wood Harper, mentioned that in some cases there was poor tool set selection so that the users, the designers, found it difficult to sign off on work, difficult to get things done because the information was not related. Well, let's start with a first demonstration scenario in Polarian. We're going to ask some how questions. How do I get requirements into Polarian? Once they're in, how do I refine and develop those requirements? And how do I get requirements back out of Polarian? So I'm going to leave the PowerPoint for a moment and shift over to a virtual machine where Polarian is running. I'm going to pause for a moment and check and see if there's any chat questions or questions and answers. I don't see any at this point. Again, I would encourage you to interact with my discussion here. Ask questions of the panelists, ask information about what we're looking at, and I'll pause and be able to go into more detail. So even though we can't speak with one another on the webinar, I can certainly go down different segues and explanations as you would like. You're viewing here the web interface for Polarian. So it's running on Firefox, but it's also supported through Internet Explorer, Google Chrome, Safari, on virtually any device or any platform. Recently, I started up and ran the Polarian testing interface on an iPad and passed it around to the viewing audience and gave them an opportunity to hold the iPad and execute test cases directly from the iPad. Now, maybe the iPad's not the greatest place where requirements are refined, but it shows an example of being able to take the user interface for Polarian wherever that business analyst or requirements engineer might be. What we're looking at is a two-pane interface. On the left-hand side is the navigation pane. This sets the context for the work that I'm doing, and I can set up my own shortcut menu, and I can also have a more detailed view of all of the functionality of Polarian. In the right-hand side, I have the workspace. And this workspace becomes very important to initial users of Polarian because it helps me find the right space to do my work. We're going to be spending most of our time here in requirements and specifications. But I could also take a look at release planning, and with the appropriate licensing and rights, I can look at what's going on in the testing area, what's being done with the requirements in the development area. Okay, well, normally I might jump right to specifications, but I'd also like to show you one thing, which is where David Merrill comes each time I log on to the system. I come to the My Polarian page. Now, in the My Polarian page, every user will have a dashboard that they can customize to show what is my work or what is my work today. So here you can see for David Merrill that I have assigned one task and one defect. These are assignments to me that I should be working on. So if I'm a developer, I can see those tasks and start coding and working against them immediately. If I'm a requirements engineer, it's possible that this task is to do some research and development into competitive information about a particular requirement. As I move further through this page, you can see that I have items which are awaiting my approval. And so I should go in and make sure I either approve or disapprove of specific requirements in this case. And also, anytime changes have been made to items and artifacts that are important to me, I'll be able to visualize that here under potential change impact and monitor the changes of all my peers and how it relates to my work. Over here on the right-hand side is an activity stream, and the activity stream shows recent activity and allows me to set up, and I can even comment right from this screen and place those comments directly into the long-term history of that particular artifact. So from here, you can customize everything that somebody needs to do to work in their specific release or version of requirement solicitation and refinement, or if I was a developer, to manage the particular work iteration that I'm in at the moment. What defects have been assigned to me and need to be resolved. Okay, well, let's go back to this specification area. So I've moved now to the specification tab on the left-hand side of my screen, and I have a home page, not for everything, but rather for specifications itself. And I can see here specific documents, requirements documents, and specification documents that are already in my system. And I have some information about the status of those requirements. You can see here on this vBoard that I have a simple breakdown of the specification of business cases, of user requirements, and functional requirements. These are the requirements which are being refined and, if you will, going through the workflow that you see here on the right-hand side. Everything begins as a draft, and as I refine them, I review them and ultimately approve or reject them. That represents all the work done here on the specification column of the vBoard. In production, I have requirements which are accepted and being implemented. And over here in the verification column, I have requirements which have been implemented already and verified. These are the requirements which I would expect to be linked to released product and released code. So this dashboard gives me a quick look to see how well I'm doing in this particular project, in this particular area of requirement design. It's a good note to make that a Polarian server has many projects, and these projects can be organized in a hierarchical way. So I can build project groups of any level of depth. And inside project groups, I can have shared or similar projects and use the project groups to assign roles and responsibility, as well as rolling up reports and dashboard information. Okay, well, let's start answering the important question of how I get requirements into the system. I'm going to begin with importing a document that contains requirements already. Let's take a look at that requirement document. I'm going to come over here and open up Microsoft Word, where I have that document already loaded. And so this is nothing more than a common Word document. You can see that it has a typical header and footer, title information, contents, and so forth. And as I move through this document, it also has paragraph and heading information at the top of the document that might be common to set up the standards for this particular set of requirements for this project. And then later in the body, I have the actual requirement. It's not uncommon for an organization to have hundreds of these documents in file servers. And so we need an efficient way of being able to bring them away from the file structure of Word into the structured format of Polarian. And so we'll begin by pointing to that document. So I'll browse to that location and find the document in question. And I'm going to open this in Polarian, not in Word, but in a preview mode. And the preview mode is going to show me how that document would look in Polarian based on a set of rules and criteria for incorporating or deconstructing that document into Polarian requirements. So here we can see now that we've moved to a 3-pane system. I'm going to minimize the navigation pane on the left, and I have a set of rules which are being displayed here in the right-hand side. So I can change the document name. So for example, let's call this, since it's 2012, we'll call this eLibrary 2012 and Requirements Management Webinar. So I can change the name, and I can set what space or what area in my project this document will reside. We'll keep it in specification. And below here I have a rule that says mark paragraphs from the document as requirements if it contains the keywords must and should. So I don't necessarily have to pay attention to styles in the document. This document could come through almost as a straight text document with writing in paragraphs. And I can use natural language to identify the requirements. So here visually on the left-hand side in the preview, you can see that an icon is created and a temporary number given associated to those items which look to be requirements. And I can review this in preview mode and see whether or not this matches my expectation. So let's look at a couple of items. Well, as I move through this document, you can see that in some cases I have bullet points which are not included in the requirements. So I'm going to make some changes here and say, for example, showing advanced options and making sure that in the next paragraph after a requirement, if it happens to be a list item, then I want to make sure that that gets included in the previous requirement. And by clicking this preview button, I will refactor the document according to the new rule set. And moving down to view, I can verify that now these list items have been included in the top level requirements. Now, if that's really not what I was looking for, if I wanted to not do that, but if I wanted to rather take those list items and make them individual requirements, I can change some settings here so that if it's a list item, it will create its own independent requirement. Let me check in with some chat. So there's a note, George mentions that the images aren't updating so quickly, so I'll try to move a little bit slower. Sometimes the network latency for WebEx means that it's going to all cascade for you in the sequence and update quickly. Also keep in mind that I am recording this, so you'll be able to look at the full recording afterwards if you would like as well. So I changed the criteria and I clicked preview, and we can see that the new document has created indented requirements where there was bullet points. So if I'm satisfied with this organization now, I'm going to click import. And now instead of temporary information, this will be fully integrated into Polarian. We will be able to maintain the document view. It will look and behave a lot like Word in terms of editing, printing, exporting, but it's going to be very different because it's no longer just a document, but it is a view to the underlying requirement content. So as I move through here and find these items like this requirement for user registration, or let's look at this one for login, logout. Immediately from this point, I can start modifying this requirement. So one avenue for modification might be, I'd like users to be able to use their Facebook accounts. And I'd also like to be able to use Google accounts as part of the web interface for this eLibrary application. Additionally, if I needed to include images, I can paste images from the clipboard, or I can bring them in from any file. And once inserted as part of the artifact, as part of the requirement, you can resize it in any format. When I click Save now, I'm not just saving a document file, but rather I'm saving the one requirement that I modified. And we'll come back to this several times. But even though in our presentation today I'm just one person editing one document view, in Polarian I can have many people simultaneously viewing and editing any document and making changes without conflict. Now this is just some of the basic information here. If I want to reach out and expand more of the details, more of the attributes in this view, I can show the sidebar. So in opening up the sidebar now, I can see some of the expanded information associated with this particular artifact. From here, I can change the severity from should have to must have, for example. And I can move it through its workflow process. So instead of just draft, I would like to be able to send this to approve, basically saying, I would like this to be, this is now marked as reviewed and it's ready for approval. In doing so, certain workflow states can have associated required fields. So one required field here is a requirement type. So I can use this attribute to extend my concept of a requirement to say this is actually a user requirement. And then I'll save this information once again. Behind the scenes, one of the things that Polarian is doing is constantly making revision changes to the database. So I will always know, as we'll see, who did it, when did they do it, and where did they do it. Well, if I'm looking for, again, a more detailed view of the whole system, I'm going to leave this document view for a moment and take a look at a more structured table view of these requirements. So here in this view, I have the same structure that we see in the document, including the heading organization, as well as all the included and new requirements that we've been working on. And so from here, I can make changes to one or many of them in the more detailed information that shows up here below. I'm going to open up this one requirement in a new window so that we can see all of the attributes. Here in this window, I still have the severity and the status, which we saw before, but now I can do things like make assignments. I'll assign it to David Merrill. If I think that I want to be able to estimate how long it will take to fulfill this requirement, I can enter that data in here as well. I can also assign it to specific releases, that this will be a release 1.0 requirement. And beyond description, I have some extra ability to enter in comments. Why is this a must-have? Whatever relevant data it might be, instead of being caught in an email thread someplace, becomes part of the permanent aspect of this artifact. So when I save this change for this record, that comment will always be available for other people to reply to and to view throughout the entire history of this artifact. Additionally, I can set up approvals. I can link external code to this particular artifact, and I can include hyperlink and attachments as well into this particular requirement. So if I had an external justification document or competitive analysis, I could attach that to this particular requirement that might justify why I should use Facebook and Google accounts as part of the description. Okay, well, once I've refined these requirements, and I'm going to ask you to dial forward and imagine what it was like after this entire document has been worked on, and all the appropriate changes that I might make are done. So here, for example, I have a partial requirement. Now, maybe I don't really even know what this is, and I'd like to delete that. So I can get rid of that requirement very easily. If I have two requirements that I need to consolidate, it's done very simply. Just position the cursor in the right place and press the backspace key. And now, instead of one requirement, I have two. And if I need to create a new requirement, then it's as simple as just pressing the Enter key. And so now I can have a user administration sub-requirement. And as soon as I press Save, you'll see that that temporary number has been assigned a permanent Polarian work item ID. And that's the identifier that I'll be able to reference it throughout its history in Polarian. And you can see that by virtue of its indentation here in the document, that EL389 has a parent. It is linked to EL333. So I have the linkage that's necessary to complete my work breakdown structure of my requirements artifacts. Well, let's see what we need to do to get this back out of Polarian in a way that our stakeholders can have benefit. So from this view, let me minimize the sidebar. I'm going to do something called word round trip. Now, word round trip allows me to export this document back into a Word format, but not just an unstructured format. It will export the format into a very structured Polarian view. And I have three options to choose from. One is to send it to a stakeholder that would only review and comment. I can send it to a customer that would allow me, or I would allow them to reprioritize certain requirements or other special attributes that you would enable. Or in this case, I'm going to choose collaboration, which would allow that customer or that contractor or consultant to help me refine the entire set of requirements by fully collaborating on the document. I'm going to choose that mode, and I'm going to start the download. Now, normally that I would take this and save it and then send it to someone via email, perhaps, require their comment, and get the document back. For the purposes of our presentation, though, I'm going to open it right away in Microsoft Word. And you can see that it looks very much like what we started out with originally. But as I move down through the document, even though it has the original image, the original text in the initial pages, as I move down through here, we'll see that what I get at is the latest view of information from Polarian. So if it has a graphic in the description, we'll see that here. So directly now from Word, I have access to being able to change values, like resetting the priority. So maybe as a customer, I don't think this is a must-have. This is really a nice-to-have. And so I can change that value and perhaps attach some comments into the specific work item to say something like, really, Google accounts are not that important to us. And I can comment at any point in the document, whether it's inside a particular work item or requirement, or whether it's out here to say something more like editing feedback. This section needs more information. And as I move down through here, I could also make the type of changes you might make if I'm, for example, going to set up a bullet list or other lists within a particular document. So anything that I would do, I can do within this interface, and then I'll go ahead and save that. Now, it's important to also note that it's not necessarily the case where only one person can edit the document and return it. This document could go to another individual who makes changes and to another, and track changes will be enabled throughout the process, and it will be waiting essentially to bring this information back into Polarian. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to return to my Polarian interface here, and the complement of round trip export is round trip import. And so I'm going to locate the file that was changed by the stakeholder. It's sitting on my desktop now. And we can verify the name of it. I could view it if I wanted to validate it, but I'm going to import it right away. Now I could choose to import only the comments. I could choose to overwrite any potential conflict between work items that have changed in the Word round trip document as opposed to what's changed within the Polarian database itself. Now we're looking at the new view. And so I'm going to show the sidebar again, and we're going to look at the comments. So you can see that the comments have been added here, and if I just click right on the comments, I'll be able to jump directly to that location where the comment was entered. See the comment, perhaps reply, very well, we'll make changes. And now begin to edit this as that stakeholder had requested. So once done, you can see now the comments are gone, and I've made the modifications required. Now, how do we look at the lifetime of this particular document? As we've been making changes all along, Polarian has saved the instance of all of these changes. So I could go back and look at what that document looked like at the point of import and see the original form of the document, or I could also look at two different versions of the document and compare. So this particular comparison is going to show me the changes that were done by the person who performed the word round trip edit. So I can see the additions to the comments. I can see the modification to work items. In red are items which have been deleted. In purple, items which have remained the same. And in green, things that have been added. And I can see that both at a document view as well as a work item view itself. So I can visualize the discrete work items that have changed and hyperlink directly to locations where I can view and see that work item in much greater detail as we're used to seeing. I'm looking now at a historical version of this particular work item, and I can look at the current by clicking the Show Current button, and now I'm looking at the latest, greatest version of this particular requirement. And so perhaps at this point, I'm ready to approve this. And so I'll go ahead and move through that life cycle for this particular requirement. And know that it's possible not just to approve one requirement at a time, but you can approve many requirements at one time and even approve and review an entire document at one time as well. All right, let me pause for a moment and see if there's any questions. Okay, one question is, does Polarian support Agile? The answer to that is absolutely true. So as I mentioned before, we're really only looking at one particular methodology in this case. It's a little bit closer to a waterfall or V model. However, Polarian itself is an Agile shop. Our developers, the leaders of our developers are Scrum Masters, and we have bi-weekly sprints, and they use Polarian in that process to not just develop requirements, but to design and track user stories and epics, which go directly to Agile sprints to be able to be worked on with more power being moved to the actual developer to make the decisions and the designs necessary. So Polarian will allow us to be able to respond to that Agile change. Okay, another question is asked, when you import a document from an existing document, can you retain the existing requirement numbering and identifiers? Yeah, that is absolutely true. Again, we're looking at a very basic organization here, but if I had a known requirement number that was coming from an external system or from an outline numbering, I would be able to capture that as a distinct field and set the field value based on what's in the document. Even to the point where in Polarian, even though we use a work item ID, we could have a custom field which is that external requirement number, and we can display that requirement number as prominently as any work item ID within the document itself. So if I needed to configure the document to display different values, I could slip in, for example, instead of ID, maybe I would like to see a more contextual outline number as part of the display. And instead of just showing the severity or priority of the requirement, I'd also like to show its status. And so with those simple changes, I can refactor the document based on that configuration. And now, instead of viewing work item IDs, I see outline numbers. And instead of just having one extended attribute here, I have two. And so you can really add any custom field to this display and organize the information in a way that makes sense for you and makes sense for your stakeholder. Great question. I appreciate that. Okay. Well, especially in requirements management, we find that working with documents is very important. Keep in mind also that as we work with different versions, different variants of a project, sometimes it's important to take whole sections of a known document and be able to branch that to a new version. So, for example, this document we've been working on, this is the eLibrary requirement specification. Suppose I now needed to supply a product to universities. So there is a very different set of additional requirements that need to be added to this. But I don't necessarily want to restart the entire requirements process. Well, to do that in Polarian, it's very simple. It's called branching or live branching. And in branching, I'm going to create a new requirement document. We'll call this eLibrary University Edition. And we can still put it in this project. We could also put it in some other project. If I had a different project that was going to contain that university variant, I could place it directly there. For our benefit, we'll just keep it in the same. And so now in creating this new document, instead of having hundreds of newly minted requirements, I will refer back to those requirements that we already imported. The document will look exactly the same as what we're used to seeing, but instead of having hot access to other requirements, I have read-only access. I cannot make changes to the requirements here in this document. To make a change to the central requirement, I would have to go back to the original requirement specification. But what I can do, for example, here is back to our user login, I can insert more information. So let's put it's a paragraph below. Let's create a new requirement. And it's going to be a sub-requirement because this is university IDs and logins must be accepted. Or, you know what, let's keep this within our should. Well, we'll keep it with must. All right, and so now I can save that new requirement, and that new requirement in this variant, if I look at the sidebar, you can see that it automatically builds a relationship to the original requirement in the common set of specifications. So using branching is a very convenient way to take these common requirements that have already gone through an approval cycle and been implemented and augmenting them for minor releases, for the next version of major release, or for operational variants as well. Okay, well, let's tune back to the PowerPoint for just a moment because I'd like to go to the next scenario. So we talked about getting requirements in and out of Polarian. We've gone through a process of refining and developing requirements. But now we have another scenario here to address, which is who made the change? When change happens, right? It happens a lot in an Agile environment, but it still happens in a V-model environment where I'm more plan-based. And if you had to ask yourself the question, what is the right requirements document for this version, and where is it? And how do I organize that requirement with the other design specification, which somebody else authored and is someplace else? And then how does my current approval match up to all of those changes? If these are some of the questions that you have to ask today that become time-consuming in a manual process, that is exactly what Polarian looks to solve. We're going to answer the question, who made the change? Why was the change made? When was the change made? And what was impacted by the change? So to do that, we'll go back to Polarian, but we'll spend a little bit less time in these document views. So document views are helpful, absolutely, but sometimes we want to have extended capability. So particularly as we start looking at the more complex linking between different types of requirements and test cases, we would like to be able to see and visualize that in Polarian. So I'm going to go back to the specification space for a moment and take a very quick look, not so much at documents, but this view down below here. So for example, I've introduced, I have some other requirements here. I'd like to see about my test coverage for these 4 user requirements. And when I view that, I'll be able to see a brief page which shows me any requirement that does not have specific test cases. So here's an example of one, a login page requirement that doesn't have a test case. And so I could take a look at those items directly and make some changes. So here, I'll be able to view that particular requirement that is missing a test case. So I have EL223, a login page. Now you can see here that it links up to parent requirements and a business case, but it does not have an associated test case. So I'm interested in to find out what test case might verify that requirement. So I'm going to start by just copying the ID of that. And Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't have my browser set up to be able to copy between my sessions, so we'll just remember EL223. And I'm going to open up a new tab, and instead of viewing, in fact, let's go here. Instead of really knowing what to look for, all I want to know is there a test case out there that's designed for login? So I'm just going to type the word login and start looking for things. Right away, you can see that it pulls up an icon here which tells me this is a test case for logging into the portal. And what I'd like to make sure now is that this test case can also verify the requirement we just looked at, EL223. So I'm going to edit the work item links here, and we're going to add a new one. And if you remember, it was EL223. So I can either just type that in, or I could also pull up a search to be able to find that. And we want to be able to specify that this test case is going to verify that requirement. And then I'll choose Save. And what that will do, if we go back and now look at this work item, I'll refresh this view. And now we can see that that test case has been traceably linked to this particular requirement. Now, why is that important? Well, we can certainly view all the traceability in a matrix, and that's easily seen here in the testing space, where I pull up a test case traceability table, and it will be able to show me all of my requirements and all of the verifying test cases, and additionally any defects which are created. So I can move through here and make sure that I'm picking the right set of requirements and see where a requirement does, or in some cases doesn't have a test case. So these missing elements here in the second column would indicate to me that further test management is required to make sure that every requirement has a verifying test case, as we talked about earlier. Well, what happens when this change occurs? Well, here we have a test case. Let's go back to EL223 for a moment, and I'll make a change. So instead of should have, this is must have. And here, instead of when user accesses the eLibrary portal, he or she needs to log in and provide valid credentials from Facebook and Google only. So just a couple of text edits, but a significant change in the design to this particular requirement. And instead of just merely saving it this time, I'm going to do something called Save and Suspect. Now, Save and Suspect is something which I can set either individually when I make certain changes like I have here, or across the board as an attribute of an entire requirements document or an entire server. And what you can see is that the test case that we had just linked now has been specially marked. And the owner of that test case has been identified and sent a message that something has changed. Impact has happened to this particular test case. So let's open that up and see what it looks like. Well, if I come in as the test manager, I see that EL36, log into portal, the test case necessarily goes back to a change in the requirement EL223, because as the test engineer, I don't know right off the bat what was changed or who made the change or even when the change was done. I just know that I need to take action. And so to do that, I look at my test case and then I'll click on the requirement. Now the requirement shows me the current state. But if I view the history now, I'll be able to answer that question. Who made the change? David Merrill. When was the change made? Thursday, April 26, 10:24 Mountain Time. What was the change? And why was the change made? So I look at that and I see, all right, the test case now has to include Facebook and improperly spelled Google accounts only. So that's a change to the test case itself. Well, let me go back now to the full view here, and I might enter in a comment to say, you know, we should have discussed this in our last meeting. And I could say things, we'll make changes ASAP. So I'm just commenting, perhaps as a test engineer, into this particular requirement so that the requirements engineer, the business analyst, has visibility there. But now I'm ready to go back to my test case. And now with that new information, I can modify the description here to be able to enter user details of not admin, but my Google account. We'll just keep it simple with that one. And instead of just a smoke test, I'm going to say this is now going to be more part of a basic test. And once I've made these necessary changes, now I'm ready to move down into the link work item area. And because of these changes, I can take off the suspect flag and save all that information. Once this information has saved, the impact of the change of that requirement has been corrected with respect to this test case. Now, there may be other impacts of change in other work items and artifacts, and all of those responsible parties will have to edit and manage that. Okay, let me take a look at questions. Question is, what does the severity smoke test mean? That's an excellent question. This is an example project, and the severity values here are something which you can decide. So this is not Polarian telling you you can only have 4 types of severity of a test, or even that you should have a field and call it severity. But it is meant to prioritize a particular test and can be used later on when it comes time to executing a test run. So for example, it would be very easy for me to build what's called a smoke test template to say, go out for my eLibrary project, find me for release 1.0 all of the test cases that are of the severity smoke test, and set that up for David Merrill to perform a smoke test of the eLibrary application build. Something very quick, not very detailed, doesn't take a whole lot of time, but is just a quick smoke test or overview of the resultant product. And so all of these values that you see here can be used in criteria further on in other parts of the system. Okay, ultimately, once we work on cultivating all of these requirements, we would like to see them organized and be part of the functional release. So what I'd also like to point out in conclusion is as we build these requirements documents, in some cases the documents themselves handle a particular release, or the documents handle a superset of functionality. And here in release planning is where I can associate specific versions of my software releases with specific requirements that should be included. So this release planning gives me a dashboard about the requirements in the accepted, implemented, and verified stage. So this is dealing more with that right-hand side of the vBoard. And it shows me how many I have planned in this release, how many have been accepted, how many have been implemented and verified. And these are all hyperlinked. So if I just click on that number, I'll be able to see all of those requirements. Down below here, I have a chart which tells me how well I am in progress to execute that particular release. How many labor hours do I have left? Am I above or below the line for completion? And then I can see affiliated here all of the specific requirements that are planned in this version. And if I come across requirements that seem to be failing test cases, they're too difficult, we can't get it done, then it would be very simple for me to highlight a particular requirement as a development manager, as a business analyst, and say instead of being in release 1.0, I don't know when this is going to get done. So I'm going to unassign it from that release. And we're going to implement I'm going to put the comment in place to say something to the effect of cutting to product backlog. We underestimated this. So this becomes the regular aspect of change that you will be used to working on. Well, I'm coming to the conclusion of my time here, and so I'll finalize with answering the how question. How do you take the next steps with Polarian? As I mentioned before, you can go to Polarian.com and download a 30-day trial. It takes about 10 minutes to set up on a Windows workstation. And everything that you saw today from the eLibrary project in my demonstration will be available to you in that trial. You can also try it live online without having to install, but if you want to try importing your own documents, you will need to download that free 30-day trial. On the online demonstration or test drive, you won't be able to introduce your own requirements documents into the process. Additionally, you can contact Polarian and request a more detailed proof of concept or a detailed demonstration. And you will also be able to see on the Polarian website a lot of information associated with training and how do I set up and create a new work item? How do I execute a test run? So things outside of the boundaries of what we've had to do today. Also, I would love to hear from you. I would love to understand your comments. I want to understand, what are your requirements challenges? Did we talk about something today that responded to those challenges, or are they of a particular nature that maybe we should open up a dialogue and see if more detailed view into Polarian will answer some of those challenges? So I'd like to thank you very much for your participation. This will conclude the formal part of the webinar, and I'll stop the recording.